hear me? Excellent. Okay. Well, I want to welcome you to today's program. My name is Candace Summers. I am the Senior Director of Education here at the McLean County Museum of History. And I also just realized I have to do all the little bits and pieces. I'm used to just introducing a speaker and then turning it over to them. But I want to remind everybody that this is being live streamed and recorded. So if you don't want it to live on the internet forever, mind your P's and Q's. When you have questions later at the end of the program, I'll repeat them so our folks on the live stream can hear them as well. And I want to thank our live stream sponsor, WGLT, Bloomington Normal's public media, part of the NPR network, for helping us get this program out into the interverse, so people can enjoy it wherever they may be. First and foremost, I want to thank our sponsors for Mourning and McLean, our hallway case display that we have on all 3 floors of our building. Major sponsor is Pontiac Granite Company, with support from East Lawn Funeral Home and Memorial Gardens, and additional contributions from Evergreen Memorial Cemetery and Kibler Brady Russman Memorial Home. I sense a theme with our sponsors as well. I also just want to remind folks, although I'm pretty sure you've probably picked up on this already, this program is about death and mourning, and so you're going to see images associated with death and mourning pop up on the screen throughout the entire program. So just, remember, it might be unsettling to some, but death is a part of life. There's nothing we can do to escape it, much like taxes. That's a part of life too. So this, to me, is kind of like a culmination of my career here at the museum. I never thought of myself becoming a cemetery guru, that everybody just asks me all the questions about cemeteries and death and mourning, and never saw myself when I was 25-year-old Candace starting at the museum all those years ago. But I have embraced it, and I'm just fascinated by the history that our cemeteries and the places where people rest, all that history contains. And so over the course of doing the Evergreen Cemetery Walk, those 20 years, it sunsetted last year if you hadn't heard, I've learned about the stories that people have, that it's not just the monument, but the person associated with the monument, all their stories, and how those monuments can tell us history out there. What things were fashionable at the time that person died, what the symbols mean on their monuments. And so it's important for us to understand the rituals and practices that surrounded funerary culture during the late 19th and early 20th century, because some of those hang on with us today. And I'll explain some of them as we go along. Why do we send flowers? Why do we have a wake? Things like that. So it's important for us to understand how and why we mourn and remember the people who have gone before us. Because death was a frequent visitor in early U.S. history, and it arrived through disease, starvation, violence, and warfare, and it was an inevitable force both feared and accepted by society. Our modern mourning and funerary customs and practices around death have deep roots, particularly in the 19th century, especially with the Civil War, the death of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, and so a lot of those cultures and practices come from there. And over time, the need to honor and memorialize the deceased has manifested itself in various ways across cultures and eras, ranging from simple rituals to elaborate ceremonies steeped in tradition. So I will preface that this presentation is heavily about Victorian customs and culture, because that's what we have a lot about in our collection. A goal of mine someday is to expand it to look at other cultures who have made McLean County home and include their death practices as well, much like we're upon Day of the Dead that we'll be commemorating at the end of this month. Who cares for the deceased? So that would be the role of undertakers and funeral homes. I found a lot of really fascinating photos, ones that have probably not been seen in many, many years, and so you're going to see a lot of them here. This particular one is the funeral of Judge Lewis Fitzhenry at the old Second Presbyterian Church just down the street. The evolution of the modern funeral industry reflects society's changing attitudes towards death and mourning, as well as changing technologies. Until the late 1800s, funeral rites were a simple family affair that happened in the home. They were also quick because there was few ways to preserve the body of the deceased. The family was in charge of all aspects of the funeral, preparing the body for burial. Women typically washed and dressed the body in finest clothing, while other family members sought cabinet makers to construct the coffins. Prior to the widespread use of embalming, the custom of large floral arrangements was more often used for masking the smell of decomposition than out of respect for the deceased. One of the traditions we have that has evolved, we no longer really need to mask smell, but we still have lots of flowers that accompany funerals to this day. Although that practice is even waning, where you see in a lot of announcements about funerals, in lieu of flowers, make a donation, plant a tree. Because I know when family members have passed away, what are you going to do with all those flowers after the end of the ceremony? Ice could also be used to employ and help slow decomposition, either by using ice caskets, which had a false bottom where the ice was placed under the deceased, or cooling tables, much like this one that's on display in the hallway on the 3rd floor as a part of our collection. Cooling boards could be set up in the person's home for embalming, be used to temporarily lay the body while a casket was being selected, or to display a casket in the home during the wake, and you could put ice underneath of it to cool the body as well. Family members were typically responsible for transporting the deceased to the church for services or to the cemetery for burial, whether it was on foot or hiring a wagon maker to transport the body to the cemetery in a horse-drawn wagon or hearse. Now, this is a very modern picture of an old Victorian hearse. I actually just literally found this yesterday in our digitized collections. I don't know how I missed this before, but here we are. And so Helen Bittner used this for her funeral in 1989. So I think it's interesting how occasionally you'll still see these old horse-drawn hearses used in modern funerals today. In some cases, families were also responsible for digging the graves at the cemetery as well. But by the latter half of the 1800s, those individual tasks of preparing the body for burial, the casket making, and organizing all the details were combined into one role, and that was the undertaker. Bloomington's first undertaker was John Wolcott, who came to Bloomington in 1843. A cabinet maker by trade, he occasionally made coffins by request. But that casual business venture evolved into undertaking establishment. I also kind of like that he's using like an old style Egyptian sarcophagus here. That's the archaeologist in me. That's why I really like this advertisement. Soon after his arrival in Bloomington, Wolcott went into business with Goodman and Lyman Ferry, who were the first wagon makers in Bloomington. And since wagon makers are often called upon to transport coffins to cemeteries for the burial, they became undertakers. In 1849, Wolcott was managing his own undertaking business, and this ad from the 1855 Bloomington City Directory notes that he had every size and variety of plain or carved coffins constantly on hand. His ad also noted that hearses and attendants when required and everything pertaining to the undertaking business. And by 1876, he was also performing embalming as well. Between 1849 and 1911, about a dozen undertakers, including Wolcott, were in business in Bloomington Normal, although most of them only stayed in business about a year or two. And by the turn of the century, undertakers began being referred to as funeral directors and their business as funeral parlors or funeral homes. The oldest continuously operating funeral home is Kibler Brady Russman, which was founded in 1872 by Louis Flinsbach, who had worked as a carriage maker and blacksmith since 1859, but entered the funeral business as a side gig, which often happened when he added funeral supplies to his offerings. In 1874, Flinsbach partnered with Cornelius Deanan, who was an employee of his since 1870, and Deanan became the undertaker while Flinsbach continued to focus on carriage making side of the business. And their first ad in the 1874 City Directory right here advertises every style of coffins and caskets constantly on hand. Does that sound familiar to you? And also a splendid new hearse. That must be the splendid new hearse right there. Another funeral home that had a long history in the Twin Cities was the Stubblefield Funeral Home, which began operating in 1926 in Normal. Ivan Stubblefield was born in 1889 in Funks Grove, Illinois, and he was the son of John and Minnie Stubblefield. Ivan married Bessie Harbert in 1912, and they had one son, Rule. Ivan, like most of the other Stubblefields, engaged in farming first. For whatever reason, he decided to go into undertaking, and in 1925, in January that year, he quit farming, sold all of his land, all of his livestock, all his equipment, and embarked on his new career. He graduated from Brown's Business College in Bloomington and went to the Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science in Ohio. By 1926, he had purchased a Queen Anne-style house in Normal located at 200 West Ash Street, which later became College Avenue, and commenced remodeling it and to serve as a funeral home. The Ivan R. Stubblefield Funeral Home opened on November 1st, 1926. So if you recall, this right here, Heartland Bank is there right now. And some of you may remember when the library and the funeral home shared a parking lot, and it had that great sign that said, funeral and library parking. I love that sign so much. Somebody needs to donate one to us, I'm just saying. The business was so successful that in 1939, Ivan and Rule decided to expand and remodel the house to better serve their clients. Ivan hired architecture firm of Schaefer and Houghton to do the design work. And in February 1940, they hosted an open house to showcase their improvements, which included a spacious new church-like chapel, private family rooms, air conditioning. That's a big one right there. A new electric organ and large parking spaces. So this is the only photo I could find from the pantograph that shows the new interior. I love the couch. That's my favorite part. That couch is great. And the second floor served as the family's residences. So a member of the family was always available 24 hours a day should a death occur and they were needed to attend to that family. Following Ivan's death on December 9th, 1967, Rule and his wife Eleanor continued to run the business until the 1990s. After Rule's death in 1994, the funeral home merged with Froelich Memorial Homes and later became Stubblefield Calvert Memorial Home. The memorial home leased its location from the town of Normal, which had purchased the property in 1991 until operations ceased in 2004, and in 2006, the house was torn down and replaced by a Heartland Bank building, which still stands today. Though the physical structure of the business is gone, the Stubblefield Funeral Home legacy signifies a critical moment in the professionalization of memorial services in McLean County. The next few slides are some of the tools of their trade, so to speak, that all of these are on display. If you haven't seen the displays yet, I encourage you to go after the program. This one right here is an inhaler kit. So if someone became overcome with grief or whatever, these were given out to patrons and potential clients where you would snap the little top piece open, kind of put it under their nose to hopefully revive them. And also, if you have a headache, there's some aspirin in there too. And all of these items, most of the items were donated by Eleanor Stubblefield herself. Paul burial shoes, which were adjustable shoes. They had a little tie in the back that could fit the feet of most deceased female clients and were made by the Paul Manufacturing Shoe Company of Cincinnati, Ohio. The curling iron, the best description ever on an object in our collection. Eleanor Stubblefield used this to do dead hair. Best description ever in the 1950s. And as many businesses have giveaways, but of course, I wonder if this was pre-air conditioning, because you don't think you would need it if you had the air-conditioned funeral home. But they had the fan giveaways, and lots of funeral homes in town. We have numerous ones in our collection had given these away. Compliments of the Ivan R. Stubblefield Funeral Home. Who makes the monuments? So, big part of funerary culture is the monuments that we place to honor those who have passed away. Between 1851 and 1915, there were about a dozen monument makers, some more successful than others, that were found in Bloomington Normal. The earliest one was James Haldeman, who advertised himself as an artist in the business of creating sculptures. Moore Brothers marble manufacturers could be found in 1858 by brothers John, Thomas, and Welcome Moore. I love his name, Welcome Moore. The business operated until 1917 when John passed away. If you didn't want to go with a monument maker, you could get it out of a Sears or a Montgomery Ward catalog. Yes, this is the thing. Just like you could get anything else out of catalogs, you could order a monument yourself. But what set these two retail giants apart, Sears required payment up front. Montgomery Ward, on the other hand, you could have monthly payments for your monuments because, as they stated, you need not leave the grave of your loved one unmarked just because you haven't the money to pay the full price of a memorial stone. I like that policy right there. But perhaps the largest and most well-known monument maker, I'm going to say in central Illinois, because you can find these guys' monuments everywhere, is Higgins Young Kleinow, first known as H.J. Higgins and Company, which was founded in 1876 by Hamer Higgins and operated continuously by the descendants of the original founders until it closed in 1956. And throughout the firm's entire 80 years in business, it was always located on the 200 block of East Front Street. Higgins brought in Jacob Young. So here's Jacob right here, and here's Hamer Higgins right there. And that's their third partner they would bring on, Charles Kleinow eventually. But Young was brought in as a partner in 1878, and Higgins and Young had worked together at Haldeman's from 1869 to 1873, where they were both apprentice stoneworkers. In 1890, they added Kleinow to the picture as a partner as well, who had also worked in the firm Higgins and Company since 1878. Now, pay attention to what's in their hands. See all their tools here? Those are all the hand tools that they were using to cut the monuments. We have a lot of them in our collection now, thanks to the descendants of Charles Kleinow, who donated them to us. Now, initially, they used these hand tools, but eventually they went on with pneumatic tools, which would have been used by like an air compressor, and that would have made it much easier to cut stone instead of, just chiseling away with the hammer and the chisel. You could actually use that pneumatic air hammer to do some of that work for you. In 1886, Higgins, probably because the business was so successful, created a new building, a new 3-story building, one that showcased his skills and talents as a monument maker. Higgins worked closely with local architect George Miller to design this new building for his business. Located at 227 to 231 East Front Street, it is fronted with marble and incorporates Victorian Romanesque design elements such as modest granite pilasters, right here, an arch, intricate carvings, and oriel windows. Oops, right there. This was like his business card right here because Higgins and other stonecutters of the firm, they did that work on the outside. So this was like, hey, this is what I can do for you, for your monument. You should really come and pay us a visit. This building still stands today, and it's Parr's rugs on the bottom, and the top is still residential, much like this was when they were here as well. And out of this building came a variety of monuments of character that were created for anyone at any price. And stonecutters employed by this business could produce both simple and grandiose monuments that can be found throughout cemeteries in McLean County, Illinois, and beyond. I like how you can see the raw materials they're working with here. This guy's like, don't take my picture. Why are you taking my picture? And this is one of my favorite pictures. So I can tell you where these monuments are out in Evergreen Cemetery. This one in particular, you're going to see here in just a few minutes. But I just love that these existed once before they were out in the cemetery. And so when they had downtime and nothing to do, they would take scraps and make these little whimsies. We have a whole bunch of these whimsies. The dog is my favorite, although being a cat person, I wish there was a cat, just saying. But that's just tiny detailed work that they just continued to hone their skills doing these little things that they probably thought nobody would ever keep, and here they are in a museum, all 100+ years later. So by 1889, the firm was selling monuments across 8 or 9 states, with monuments appearing in cemeteries as far away as Los Angeles, New York City, and Winnipeg, Canada. And the reason we know this is because we have some of their monument books in our collection, and you can just flip the pages and see who the people were that were buying the monuments, what they're made out of, how they're designed, how much they cost, which we'll talk about in a minute, and where they were destined for. And I was looking through these in 2016 when we featured Higgins and Young on the cemetery walk, and I couldn't believe my eyes when I would see how far away these monuments were getting shipped by railroad. It was just so cool. But this one, you can go see yourself. This is in Lexington Cemetery. One of the most notable monuments the firm created was for John Jackson J.J. Kemp, no relation to Bill Kemp, I'm just telling you. He was a prominent farmer, banker, and livestock and grain dealer. The mausoleum was constructed in 1892 out of Indiana limestone, and its face stands 22 feet high and covers a plot of land 35 by 38 feet. Notable features are these 2 Newfoundland dogs guarding at rest, also the angel at the top as well. It is faced with limestone, and it has the 4 marble columns as well. And according to newspaper accounts, Hamer Higgins thought this was his masterpiece. So that's pretty cool. And you can't miss it when you go in that cemetery. It's one of only 3 mausoleums in the entire cemetery. Another notable monument that was created was for the homegrown opera diva Maria Lita, who died in 1883 at the young age of 27. Composed of Barry Vermont Grant, the Lita monument includes a 17.5-foot shaft topped by a draped urn representing eternal life, although the overgrown tree here kind of blocks it a little bit. And all the sides of her monument have quotes. And I quote, "A bird singing the richest and rarest melody has gone forever from the groves of time, and the voice which caught the highest symphonies of nature has joined in the chorus of the infinite." The 8 men who carried Lita's coffin to her gravesite in Evergreen Memorial Cemetery formed a committee to raise funds to erect this monument in her honor. Through a series of concerts and collections of donations, they raised a total of $1,450, which today would be the equivalent of almost $50,000, and commissioned Higgins and Company to create this work of art. David Davis, we also have his monument as well. It's a 24.5 feet tall, also made of Barry granite. A lot of our monuments in Evergreen are made of this gray granite. It was kind of the favorite material that Higgins and Company used, and almost exclusively towards close to the 1900s, they used Barry Vermont granite. His funeral in 1886 had about 20,000 people in attendance. Recognize this monument here? Yep. So this monument was created for F.W. Cook. It's in Old City Section 8, a 4-sided pedestal monument made out of Barry granite, topped with a marble statue of a young woman. Now, whenever you see the marble statues on top of grave markers in Evergreen Cemetery, they were not made locally. Why we know this? Because of this little gem right here. So in that monument book from Higgins, Young, and Kleinow, when I was turning the page, I was like, what is this little piece of paper folded down? And I folded it up. They had glued the statue that this guy wanted right in the monument book. They must have clipped it out of maybe a Sears catalog. Who knows? But I just think that's so cool that every detail, just right down to the drawing, to the statue he wanted, is recorded in these ledgers. The Bloomington Cemetery Vault is also another one of their masterpieces. Before mechanized grave digging, the vault was used to temporarily house coffins in extremely cold or wet weather until burial was possible. Didn't have backhoes back then, people, so these graves were dug by hand, and trying to dig a grave in January would probably be an impossible task. The vault seen here was built directly into the side of a hill of what was then Bloomington Cemetery. Higgins and Company designed and constructed it in 1888. The vault is faced with limestone and has excised lettering, means the lettering sticks out. And the entrance is embellished with this pediment right here. And today it's used to store maintenance equipment and was updated in 2010 with all new landscaping. Now, a few weeks ago when I did our Dine with the Dead tour, I got a really special treat. Kay is nodding and smiling because she got to go as well. The cemetery staff let me inside the vault. And here are the pictures. So right here, you can see the niches. There's 4. So that would have been where coffins with bodies would have been interred. But the back is the coolest part, is this cross. Now I remember seeing in this many years ago when the vault had accidentally been left open, and the historian curiosity in me is like, I'm just gonna take a peek in here. And I don't remember the cross being that big, but I also was like, I'm not supposed to be in here, so I'm gonna take a quick look and run out. And so that was, I was like, did you guys repaint this just for us? And they're like, nope, we did not. And I said, oh, that's very cool. So it's neat that it's been preserved after all these years. And then we got a sneak peek, because the staff is amazing at Evergreen Cemetery. And they're like, you want to do a tour again and open it? That's cool. And I was like, I will take you up on that offer. And as I mentioned, they had a pricing structure, but they did not advertise that pricing structure. They wanted to keep competition at bay. And so the sketches of their monuments, I'll go back. Right, okay. So it might be hard to see, but right here, you see the little DYY? That's part of their secret code on how much their pricing was. So they used this, one of the phrases they used was hope and try. And so then they would, so like DYY would have been, you know, $700. So like here, HPD would be $137. And that's how they could keep the competition away so nobody knew their pricing. And so like, you know, Haldemans couldn't say, well, I will do your monument for $699. They're $700. So little pricing wars, you know. And in addition to the headstones and monuments they created other structures in McLean County, including the McLean County Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Miller Park, which was dedicated in 1913, and the fountain, literally, I'm pointing the wrong way, outside of our building on Main Street, dedicated to honor the war dead from World War II, which still functions when we have the right parts for it. When Hamer Higgins passed away in 1902, the company was incorporated as Higgins, Young, and Kleinow. After Young and Kleinow died in 1933, descendants of the 3 original partners continued to operate the company and own a majority of the stock until it closed in 1956 when the company was sold to Pontiac Granite. All comes full circle. The firm had a long and successful career because of its owners and adapted to changing taste and technology, invested wisely, and promoted business through traveling salesmen, newspaper advertisings, and word of mouth from satisfied customers. And as I mentioned, many of those monuments are in Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. According to a 1992 geographical survey done by the McLean County Genealogical Society, there are 116 known cemeteries in McLean County, and one of those is Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. It's considered the oldest in the city of Bloomington. And originally, it was 2. So you had Old City to the north, which was founded first in the 1830s is our best guess, and then Bloomington Cemetery to the south was founded in 1857. Old City began as a burial ground for John and Mary Kimler, who owned the land. According to some sources, John Kimler buried one of their children on the land, and then because no city burial ground at the time, he gave permission to friends and neighbors to bury their loved ones there as well, and it became known as Kimler's Burying Ground. The first mention of a city burying ground dates to March 10, 1851, when the city of Bloomington purchased 2 acres of land from Kimler for $103.07, which today would be the equivalent of about $4,500. And this cemetery was never subdivided into plots or sections. You just picked a spot, and there you go. There's where your dearly departed would be. Bloomington Cemetery, on the other hand, was founded on February 16, 1857. Oh, I got ahead of myself. So this is a really cool plat map I found, 1855. So technically the cemetery does exist right here, but this is before Bloomington Cemetery would have been found, so Old City would have been here. And then fast forward about 20 years, and now you have this massive cemetery, which is landlocked by now the Constitution Trail, all the neighborhoods, and Lincoln Street as well. But Linus Graves was the founder of Bloomington Cemetery Association. I mean, how could he not found a cemetery with the last name of Graves? Truly his calling. Graves served as the secretary of the Bloomington Cemetery Association and supervisor of the burial grounds for 40 years, after which time his son Arthur assumed that position and continued as manager of the cemetery until his death in 1938. So these are just some pictures of Bloomington Cemetery from a while ago, and still the same building that they use for the office at the cemetery, although no ivy, not so many plants on there now. It's kind of hidden by all that. The Civil War Soldiers section, and worth noting, they used to be upright stones. If you're familiar with out there, now they're flat stones. The best reasoning I can guess why they did that is for easier upkeep, or maybe these had started falling down as well, or a combination of both. But now they're flat, and I think they replaced those probably about the 30s or the 40s. This is the big circle. So right past would be where Adlai Stevenson, the first and second, would be buried as well, past that big circle. And these were two super cool new donations that volunteer Amy Miller gave to the museum. These stereograph cards of Evergreen Cemetery. I've never seen anything like this before. The best date I have for them is about 1889 to 1910, just based on A, the dates of the people buried there, and B, the clothing those two women are wearing. But it's so cool, and she has no idea like where they came from. She found them in a local antique store, so it's really cool. And those are on display as well, so you can get a better peek of them. One of the largest funerals ever held in McLean County was for that of Adlai Stevenson I, although I think his grandson's funeral probably surpassed that a little later on. But at the time, when he died in 1914, very big funeral. Stevenson was born in Christian County, Kentucky in 1835, and the family moved here to Bloomington in 1852 when he was 17. He was a lawyer, served in local national government as a Democrat in a staunchly Republican area, and notably served as representative for Illinois to the U.S. Congress, not consecutively, and vice president under Grover Cleveland's second term, 1893 to 1897. He also owned and operated the McLean County Coal Company on Bloomington's west side with his brothers, James and William, and served as the board of directors for People's Bank, and was on the Bloomington School Board for 2 years. And after an unsuccessful run for governor in 1908, he retired from public life and spent the rest of his life in his house on Franklin Park, which is still there, until his death on June 14, 1914 in Chicago, and his body was brought back here to Bloomington. And as far as we know, he's the only person from McLean County to lie in state in this building, right downstairs on the first floor rotunda. I have to thank a colleague of mine, Norris Porter, for finding that gem in the pantograph. Such a fantastic story. And I wish we had better pictures of it because it would be really cool. But our building right here, was the site of him laying in wake. On June 16th, a public visitation was held with his body lying in state towards the west side doors. So people would have come in through the east doors, walked up through the rotunda, paid their respects, and then walked right out the west doors. A steady stream of people came by from 1 to 2:45 p.m., and they estimate thousands of people came by to see him lie in state, because he was, a big statesman here from McLean County. And this picture right here to the right, that is the remnants of the Stevenson Escort Club. So the Stevenson Escort Club was a group of local men who formed this group to help campaign for Stevenson when him and Cleveland were running for president and vice president, but also they traveled to Washington, D.C. with the Stevenson family to attend the inauguration. And I have another picture of them in a minute, but here is them exiting the courthouse to proceed to Second Presbyterian Church where the funeral was held, and then they would have traveled to the Evergreen Cemetery for the final burial. And these were crowds of people turned away. They actually turned hundreds of people away who still wanted to see Stevenson, but they had to, go to the funeral next. And this is an original picture of some of the members of the Stevenson Club. They went to visit Mount Vernon in Virginia while they were there for the inauguration in 1893. And this is one of the ribbons they didn't wear in this picture. I zoomed in really close and they're not the same. Those are different. But the men who remained wore the ribbon on the right when they escorted his body through the funeral procession the entire day. And we don't know who donated that to the museum, but we do have one in our collection. And his final resting place at Evergreen, which you can go visit along with all the other Stevenson family members, Adley II, Helen, Buffy is out there, Adley's sister Elizabeth. And graves like Stevenson's would have been cared for by a perpetual care fund. So this was kind of like a little insurance policy that you could pay the cemetery if it was a private cemetery that would guarantee that they would mow your lawn, pull the weeds, if you had a fence, that the fence wouldn't fall down. But that money only lasted so long. And part of the problem which led to some of the neglect at Bloomington Cemetery is they just didn't have enough money to keep up an entire cemetery. And so unless you had family members willing to come out and mow the grass and pull the weeds, your grave might be very unkempt. And that helped sow the neglect of Evergreen and Old City Cemetery. By 1955, Bloomington Cemetery and Old City were a mire of dead and broken trees. You can see some of these pictures here. I mean, those weeds are almost as tall as those guys there. These pictures are from 63 and 62 at kind of the height of public outcry. Do something. How can you let our history just, go to waste like that? To address the issue, a proposal was made to have the cemetery, both of them, taken over by the city of Bloomington. But the city was not interested in managing both the cemeteries. And so a delegation of citizens showed up at City Hall on May 28, 1962, demanding the city take action to clean up the cemetery. Eventually, a proposal was made for the city of Bloomington Township to take over. And a really good reason why the township taking over would be helpful is they had the power to levy taxes. And taxes are what help keep this cemetery beautiful to this day. New legislation that the state of Illinois had passed allowed townships to collect taxes to help preserve cemeteries like this. So October 1963, the final legal hurdles were overcome, and the two cemeteries merged to form Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. And improvements began immediately to clean up the leaves, trim the shrubs and trees, upturn monuments that had fallen down, sow new grass. And they've just, as we all know, have done a fantastic job of maintaining that cemetery this entire time. So much so that they have gotten 2 awards throughout their history. In 1995, they had a Heritage Preservation Award, and in 2019, a Landscape Restoration Award that helps recognize the hard work that they do. I always like it when you're out there, either at sunrise or sunset, where you can just see the light just kind of streaming through onto all the monuments. But who mourns the dead? Mourning traditions in the United States were greatly influenced by the rituals introduced by England's Queen Victoria after the death of her husband, Prince Albert, in 1861. After his death, Queen Victoria spent the rest of her life in mourning, and Victorians on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean began to practice these elaborate and highly formal death rituals for the rest of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. One such tradition that was adopted was wearing black as a symbol of mourning. Every day the rest of her life, she wore black. That was 40 more years. And she spent the first, I believe, 3 in deep mourning where she wouldn't have hardly any contact with anybody. And this set the standard for strict dress code followed by all classes of people. They even published mourning customs in books and magazines. For example, Cassell's Household Guide, Gotti's Lady Book, and the Social Etiquette, Manners, and Customs of Polite Society. So if you were a respectable member of society, you had one of these books, and you'd make sure you had at least one black dress in your wardrobe. And it spelled out a complex dress code for mourning and mourning periods for grieving families. Entire industries emerged to sell mourning clothing, appropriate jewelry, black edge stationery, memorial cards, and more. The strictest guidelines were for women. We could actually have spent a good chunk of our lives in mourning, whether our husband died, our children died, our parents died, our cousins, aunts, uncles, friends, whoever. So us women probably had more than one mourning dress in our closets. But also high mortality rates at the time. All of us could have spent a lot of time in mourning. And the mourning period began almost immediately after death. The length of mourning depended on an individual's relationship to the deceased and could last anywhere from a few weeks to 2 years. So this is a young Victoria not long after Albert's death, and this is, I think, a picture of her towards the end of her life. Not much difference in her clothing. So widows, 2 years, at least 2 years, sometimes longer, to mourn your husband. Husbands mourn their wives for 1 year, although you might return to work fairly quickly, maybe find a new wife. It all depends. Children mourn their parents for a year. Parents mourn a child for 1 year. Siblings mourned one another for 6 months. Children for grandparents for 6 months. Aunts or uncles were mourned for 2 to 3 months. Cousins were just 4 weeks. And there were generally 4 accepted stages for mourning during the Victorian era: deep mourning, first mourning, second mourning, and half mourning. Deep mourning was reserved for widows. This is the traditional widow's weeds that we see with the veil and the heavy back clothing, the black gloves, the whole shebang. Women in deep mourning dressed heavily, concealing black clothing, wore a black bonnet with a black crepe veil to cover their faces. The fabric used for women's mourning attire was non-reflective and had no pattern, and it was, as I said, the widow's weeds. Additionally, customs dictated that widows were expected to completely withdraw from social life. You couldn't leave the house except to attend funerals or church for at least the first month of mourning. Women were also expected to avoid public spaces of amusement, theater, no visiting friends or family until the last stage of the mourning period. But after 6 months, you could lift that veil back at least. First mourning is where everyone other than widows began their mourning period. Both men and women wore black clothing. Men's clothing was not as elaborate as women's. They most likely already had dark suits in their closets, although sometimes it didn't even have to be a dark colored suit like the suit we have on display. Black gloves, a black armband, a crepe hat band. The thickness of the armband or hat band indicated the closeness of the deceased. Women at this point in mourning could wear limited jewelry, including a cameo brooch of the deceased on her neck. Could wear rings, bracelets, earrings that were made of onyx or jet. Jet is a hard, black, fossilized coal material. This dress here we have on display. This was a 2-piece black silk dress worn by Esther Wright after the death of her first husband, Clyde Gaines. I put it here for first mourning because she wore this in 1934, so I would associate that more with a later mourning stage than the deep mourning like we know with the widow's weeds, just because by the time of the 30s, these mourning stages had evolved so much it was not like what it was in Victoria's period. Second mourning is the next stage for close family and the first stage for distant relatives. Black crepe cuffs and collars could be replaced by these white ones here. The crepe veils could finally be replaced with tulle or netting. Straw bonnets, black silk bonnets could be added along with black ribbons and flowers as decoration. And the final stage of mourning, which would be demonstrated by the woman on the right, was half mourning. This was the final stage that families, especially widows, this would be a time where you gradually assimilate back into society. Clothing was no longer restricted to black, could be gradually transitioned to lighter colors like gray and white. Lavender was the final color an individual could wear before exiting mourning. Men could change their buttons from black to silver and wear white or silver or gold waistcoats. And women could wear black lace bonnets with white or violet flowers, gold, diamond, or hairwork jewelry. That's a lot of clothing to go through. Honoring the fallen. So there's many ways that people honor those who have gone before us. Mourning ribbons, like the type we see on flowers at funerals, or like I said, the armbands that people would wear. Now we even have just like the little mourning ribbon pins that they'll hand out at funerals. Bunting, drapes, flags have all served as visual symbols to publicly express grief and respect following the death of a prominent individual, to honor a fallen soldier, or during national tragedies. This is a picture here of Adlai Stevenson II's funeral. That's a typo on my slide, at the Unitarian Church in Bloomington. Mourning ribbons or armbands, typically black, were often worn by close family and friends of the deceased. A black armband would be worn on the upper right arm, and ribbons were worn on the left side of the chest, usually over the heart. While these traditions may not be common today, some continue to observe them, in part during memorial services, by wearing that black ribbon pin. This GAR badge belonged to Daniel Brubaker and would have been worn when a member of the Charles E. Hovey Post number 786 of the Grand Army of the Republic passed away. Brubaker was born in Ohio in 1841, and his family moved to Roanoke, Illinois in 1851 when Daniel was 10 years old. In 1861, Daniel joined the Union Army, serving in Company B of the 47th Illinois Infantry during the U.S. Civil War. Due to an injury he received in battle, he was discharged in late 1862. He returned to Woodford County, engaged in farming, and started a family. Around 1880, he moved with his family to a farm in North Normal, where he spent the rest of his life until his death in 1915. Members of his post would have worn that badge when they attended his funeral at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. Black mourning drape often hung on portraits of the deceased in families' homes. They were also utilized by fraternal organizations, labor unions, clubs, veterans groups, and other organizations to honor or recognize the loss of a member. And typically, if it was a club or a fraternal organization, they would use that drape for about 30 days, so from one meeting period to the next, in order to honor that member, and then they would have a ceremony to remove that as well. Again, yesterday, I found this fantastic picture from our collection that had been digitized that shows the front page of the pantograph announcing Adlai Stevenson II's death on July 14th, 1965, where they had done the black mourning drape right around it. The tradition of honoring fallen soldiers with a flag began during World War I. The U.S. government initiated the practice of draping flags over caskets as a way to honor soldiers killed in combat. This gesture was seen as a symbol of the nation's gratitude and respect for their service and the ultimate sacrifice that they gave in honor of their country. Prior to this, it was not a common practice to drape caskets with flags due to the expense of manufacturing limitations associated with making flags. This picture is the funeral of Gus Williams, who was born in Jacksonville, Illinois in 1862. His family moved to Bloomington in about 1900, and in 1917, Gus enlisted in the all-black 8th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. The 8th was federalized and became part of the all-black 370th U.S. Infantry that was deployed to France in April of 1918. Gus and the men of the 370th were engaged in trench warfare and fought with distinction. On September 14, 1918, Gus and his unit were sent to the frontline trenches of Raincourt, And it was there they encountered heavy shell fire and gas attacks, and unfortunately, Gus was killed in action during one of those attacks on or around September 26th. So his body was first buried in France, but then 3 years later, they disinterred him and brought him home for final rest in what was then Bloomington Cemetery. In 1921, the Stevenson Lewis Post number 556 of the American Legion was in charge of his funeral. Following the funeral, the Lewis E. Davis Post number 56 of the American Legion was in charge of escorting William's body to Evergreen Memorial Cemetery for burial and in charge of the firing squad that gave him his final honors. Both black and white veterans of World War I were in attendance of his funeral, but we don't know if the flag on his casket was given to family as the tradition is today. Today, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs provide a U.S. flag to drape over the casket or accompany the urn of a deceased veteran who has been honorably discharged from the U.S. Armed Forces. The modern ritual of folding the flag and presenting it to the next of kin became more formalized following World War II. The U.S. Department of Defense standardized the protocol for flag presentation in 1949, ensuring consistency across all branches of the military. And most families who receive the flag at the funeral display it in modern cases. They're ritualistically folded into the triangle, which you'll see this flag that was Lewis Myers, World War I veteran, folded in the case downstairs. This is a practice which you don't see too much anymore, post-mortem photography. I guess in a traditional sense, you don't see post-mortem photography. People still take pictures at funerals, whether it's of the family gathered. You hear the old saying, people get together for weddings and funerals, and so you take pictures when everybody's together. But some people do take pictures of the urn or the caskets at the funeral as a private way, not so much as a public way. But the invention of photography allowed the living an opportunity to stay connected with the deceased. In 1839, French artist Louis Daguerre invented the daguerreotype photography, which was the first practical application of photography. Prior to this, if you were financially able, you could have a portrait painted of the dearly departed or a sculpture, but that cost a lot of money and was only available to wealthy individuals. The majority of people only had images of the deceased that lived in their memories. Comparatively, a photograph was much more affordable. But even so, in the 1840s, with the average daguerreotype costing between $2 and $6. Now, you hear $2 and $6 today. That's not a lot of money. But if you adjust it for inflation, that would be between $88 and $264 for one photograph. This could be a significant cost to those family members, where the average household income would have been between $200 and $500, which adjusted for inflation would be between $7,500 and $20,000 today. Still not a lot of money for a photo, but despite that, grieving families felt this was money well spent because this might be the only photograph they have of that individual. Nobody has these devices like we do now that takes 1 million photographs when you just hit the tap of a button. However, some photographers took advantage to profit off of the bereaved, charging more for these images than the ordinary portrait. Some of the added costs could be attributed to the fact that the photographer had to go to the subject instead of the subject coming to their photography studio, but this alone did not justify the price. Photographers were business people, and they recognized a way to make money, so they wanted to capitalize by these post-mortem photographies. But over time, the cost of the photos decreased, and new photographic procedures were invented, including the ambrotype, which was portrait on glass, tintype, portraits on metal, and the most economical, the carte de visite, which was the portrait on paper. Most subjects in post-mortem photography were portrayed reclining as if they were asleep, whether in bed, on a chaise lounge, or on a sofa. A few subjects may have been posed, like Sarah Scott. She was posed in her baby carriage right after she passed away. She was about 2 years old. Some may have been posed in a chair, but never standing. That's a common myth. They were never propped up and standing with these, mechanical things that you see behind them. That's all a myth. To make the subject appear more lifelike, post-mortem photographers would fill the deceased's cheeks with cotton to make them look healthy, pin or glue their eyelids open, or have an artist add painted pupils on closed eyes and rosy their cheeks. Tinting photographs and painting eyes of the deceased open on photographs to make it appear as if the person was alive and well could also be done by hand. And infants and children were most common subjects for post-mortem photography due to the high mortality rates at the time. They were often the only photos they had of these children. Occasionally, living parents were photographed holding their deceased children as well. The photo seen here is Preston Butler Jr. in 1912. He was born in Bloomington in 1905. Little Preston attended Edwards School and was a favorite amongst his classmates. He was, quote, a bright little fellow whose acquaintance was enjoyed by all who came into contact with him. However, his story is a very tragic one. He had been sick for 11 months prior to his death. He had a severe attack of measles, followed by a bad cold, and then whooping cough, which turned into typhoid pneumonia. The last few weeks of his life, he suffered intensely. So in some cases, death was probably welcomed by his parents. A large number of friends and families attended Preston's funeral, which was held at the Butler House Hotel, which would have been right down the street across from the new arena. And he was buried in Park Hill Cemetery in Bloomington. By the 20th century, the deceased were typically photographed in their coffins, like here with Leonard Stubblefield. And by the 1930s and 40s, professional post-mortem photography had declined in popularity, but still this practice continues today as a more private, personal act as well. Or what you could also find was this. We don't know who he is, but I felt like it was a very telling piece where the empty rocking chair usually signifies loss. And the shells at the bottom could be Christian symbols referring to the religious pilgrimage and spiritual protection as well. And the final part that we'll talk about is a fascinating one, which is hair work. Human beings have always had a deep and personal connection to hair. The practice of making jewelry and decorations from hair, known as hair work, has appeared throughout human history, but is most commonly associated with the Victorian era mourning customs that emerged in the 19th century. In a time before photography was widely available, hair work was used as a way to remember loved ones or the dearly departed. Because hair decomposes very slowly, it's one of the few personal things that a grieving person may have left behind, other than a few belongings. A way to more permanently preserve the hair of another person, living or deceased, was to incorporate it into jewelry, such as watch fobs or necklaces, earrings, bracelets, brooches, or hair wreaths as a keepsake. By doing this, a piece of that loved one could be held close for the rest of that person's life. Hair work reached its peak in the middle of the 19th century and remained popular until about 1885. By World War I, hair work was pretty much a custom that was long gone because women did not have time for such fancy work back then. During the United States Civil War, hair work was at its height of popularity. Women made jewelry of the hair of their husbands, fiancés, brothers, and fathers who went off to war. A local example, which I wish we had it in our collection, but I only know about it due to the letters we have, was between Harriet Frances Rowell and her fiancé, George Ella. On September 25th, 1862, Harriet wrote to George, who was in Company G of the 33rd Illinois Volunteer Infantry, thanking him for the hair he had sent to her, which she made into a watch guard. This watch chain, so cool, was woven out of brown human hair. It had gold fittings with a vest bar, so here's the vest bar up the top, and a swivel at the end, and then a locket in the center. Thanks to just a smidgen of WD-40 type material, we were able to get that locket open so I could share with you the pictures of the locket's owners, which is Lyman Tay and an unidentified woman that we're assuming was his future wife, Cora. Lyman was born in Bloomington in 1876. From 1898 to 1901, Tay served primarily in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War as a member of Company G of the 20th United States Infantry in the Army. Following the war, he stayed on to teach until he returned home in April of 1902. So my theory is perhaps that Cora had either sent him hair so he could make this watch fob, or that he had sent her hair, maybe while they were courting while he was stationed overseas. Tay was an active member of the McLean County Historical Society, donating objects, assisting with exhibits, and serving on the board of directors. He married Cora Thompson on November 29, 1904 in Bloomington, and they are both interred at Park Hill Cemetery and Mausoleum in Bloomington. Hair work became so popular that you could actually send hair away to magazines and they would make it for you, or they printed instructions and patterns in these magazines like Gotti's Ladies Book or Peterson's magazine, so you could do it yourself. It was a very affordable middle-class activity. If an individual desired more fancy, intricate work, they could send the locks away. However, could you guarantee that the same hair came back to you? And that was something that the advertisements of the day, we guarantee it's the same hair that you sent us in your locket. I promise, pinky swear. And so in the May 1855 edition of Gotti's Lady Book, a lock of hair could be sent to the fashion editor, who would make it into one of several different pieces of jewelry. A bracelet cost between $3 to $15, and a watch fob between $4 and $8. Depending on how fancy you wanted it. Another form of hair work was the hair wreath. This gorgeous hair wreath is downstairs on display in the shape of a lyre. It's just amazing. I could never do something like this in my wildest dream. It never became as popular as the jewelry did, and these were typically made from multiple members of a family. And so typically they're up like a horseshoe, so the luck of the horseshoe never runs out because you've turned it down. Or in this case, maybe you ascend to heaven because it's turned up. And the most recently deceased member of the family, the hair would be in the center, and then as other family members died, their hair was put in the center and the other people's moved out above it. Just crazy, insane, intricate work. And as you can see, they fashioned flowers. They would put it around on wires so you could get those frames as well. And this is from like 1870, and it looks like it was just made yesterday. That's also how well preserved things are in our collection. Yay. This lyre-shaped hair wreath was made by Caroline Agel, who was born in 1850 in Erie County, New York. She married George Agel Sr. in New York in 1869. George owned and operated a branch of Agel & Sons leather, hides, and tanning business with his father, Frederick, and several brothers. George and Caroline moved to Bloomington in 1873, and lived here for the rest of their lives and had 3 children, George, Jr., William, and Charles. Little is known about her activities other than this beautiful piece of work. We also have another hair wreath of hers in our collection. But what I was able to find out is that she won a ribbon at the McLean County Fair in 1877 for, quote, her fancy work and hair work. I'm going to say it's for this. I have no proof that it's for this, but I'm going to say it's for this. She was also, according to her obituary, a faithful and active member of Trinity Lutheran Church, and she passed away in 1918 and was buried at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. Hair wreaths never achieved the same level of popularity as the jewelry did, and as Victorian mourning culture declined, so too did the making of hair work, jewelry, and wreaths. But because the deceased cannot actively participate in their own ceremonies, burial customs, and funerals, they are more for the living, those of us who are left behind, as these monuments and memorials we build. These traditions demonstrate the love and respect for the deceased and the reassurance of an afterlife. And while many of the elaborate and extravagant cemetery customs of these days have faded, a good number still remain. Many of us still send flowers when somebody passes away. Even the tradition of black is kind of dwindling at funerals. You see people more like in casual clothes, lighter clothes. We still hold the wake so people can come and pay their final respects, although typically not at home like they were once done. We display photos of our loved ones and friends who have passed away, typically not taking having a professional photographer come and take their image. Funerals complete with a cemetery burial are still the predominant tradition in the United States, but those preferences are turning as well to less traditional funerary options such as cremation, natural burials, aquamation, biodegradable tree pods, to name a few. And they continue to evolve as we trudge through the 21st century and cultures change, but one thing remains constant: death is one of the only guarantees in life. So I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. Thank you. Stunned silence, and that's okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. Please, if you haven't seen the displays, they're on the first, second, and third floors. You'll see many more items than I shared in my PowerPoint today. You're welcome. Thank you.